Hello everybody and welcome to our session. This afternoon we are providing you with our final session, session 3, from our series of Getting to Grips with Great Send Governance. So this session will be focusing in around some best practice guidance, some solutions and some next steps. So hopefully that's the session that you've all come to join this afternoon, and we'll be able to share some great practice across the Lancashire and West Yorkshire region. So first of all, just to remind you of who we are Nason Whole School Send, and these are our contract aims. We have shared them with you in each of the previous sessions, so I'm sure they're very familiar to you by now, but our main function is to provide the DfE school workforce contract and developing skills of people working in schools or working with schools, as yourselves do as governors and trustees, to develop your skills and knowledge in relation to SEND. So just to remind you of the previous sessions, we're just going to set the scene for tonight's sessions. So we've got an additional presenter with us today. We've got Jill Robinson OBE. Jill is a SEND expert like no other. She is the former Vice Chair of the Teaching School Council and has also been CEO of a specialist trust. Although she has retired from those roles, she absolutely hasn't retired from special education, and she's currently working as an educational advisor to the National Network of Specialist Providers, the NNSP, and she is a trustee with the co-op MAT supporting SEND across the trust. So what she'll be doing is sharing with you the role of a link trustee working with a board of governors. So it's a really valuable sort of session that she's going to provide for us tonight, because this is an area where there isn't a huge amount of confidence, because MATs are relatively new, and how to provide great SEND governance across a MAT is something that many MATs are struggling with. So I know that they'll really welcome that input from Jill. And I think if you are a maintained school who is thinking about joining a MAT, it may give you some food for thought in terms of the sorts of questions you might want to ask as part of your due diligence process. I'm here again. I'm Angela Holsworth, Regional SEND Lead for Lancashire and West Yorkshire. I'm a National Leader of Education and CEO of the Seaview Trust, which is an inclusive trust across East Lancashire and Blackpool. I've got with me Nicole Dempsey, Deputy Regional Lead for Lancashire and West Yorkshire, experienced mainstream SENCO and SEND Lead for Dixon's Academy Trust. And then we've also got Helen Howe, who is our latest member to joining the team. And Helen is an experienced SENCO working in Sefton. So just to give a bit of a recap on what we've talked about before, in our first and in our second sessions, we explored the national data. We had a look at sort of the fact that we have got, by the point we reach FE, about 17% of learners nationally in further education have identified special educational needs. And they're young people who will either need SEND support or they'll have an educational health care plan. So we've established that knowing about SEND is really important for all governors, not just the SEND governor, because these young people are a significant minority in all of our provision. We also talked about governance models and established where legal responsibility for SEND sits with different structures. We've picked up on lots of key concepts from the Code of Practice, and if you missed that session, then please do go back in, because you've got the musts there for governors just to remind people of their duties. We did sort of share in the last session some sort of review documents for SEND governance and the SEND review guide, and hopefully they're things you've been able to download from the gateway. And we heard one SEND governor talk about his experience of SEND review, which was a very positive one, and hopefully, you know, gave people some food for thought in terms of, you know, what might happen. We've really enjoyed running these governance sessions because you as participants have been so enthusiastic and so lively and joined with us and put lots of comments into the chat. So that's something that we're hoping you're going to continue with today. Helen will be doing the manning of the chat today, assisted ably by Nicole. and we will try and sort of feedback the points that come through. I'll make sure that I pause as I'm presenting to give you sort of space to actually give us your comments and share your thoughts. So our session objectives for today are to help you make best use of resources that are available, to share the case studies that we've picked up from a range of different settings, and also to share the experience of the Link Governor role, and to introduce the concept of a Lancashire and West Yorkshire SEND governance network, which is something we would like to make an outcome of these sessions. So just to reintroduce you to our favourite slide, thank you, Nicole, for supplying us with this. This is our slide where we like to say what we're aiming for across Lancashire and West Yorkshire for SEND is uncomplicated inclusion by design. So instead of creating lots of resources which can enable people to get over the fence that's there, we put in a fence where everybody can actually see through. And this is what we're aiming for in all of the work that we're doing. We shared this slide with you in the last two sessions. These are the sort of areas from the SEND review guidance, and we'd asked you in the last session to have a think about where you felt as governors your primary areas for development were. So it would be really nice if you want to have another look at that. And if you feel you've done something on that area of development using any of the resources we've been sharing with you, then please feel free to pop that in the chat, because we'd really like to hear how you're able to use the stuff we're sharing to improve your practice in your own school. And even if you haven't managed to do it yet, you're just thinking about it, it would still be great to find out what you're doing. So let's have a look at some of the regional good practice that's going on. These are all set up as little mini case studies. So each of them will have two slides. The first will identify what the problem was, then we'll share the solution, and then it will be a case of sort of what the outcome has been for this piece of work. So the first problem that we came across, and this was about good practice really, in recruiting skilled SEND governors, was a local maintained nursery school struggling to recruit skills-based governors to a local governing body. And those people who've actually supported or worked as governors in maintained nursery schools will understand it's often really challenging, because children often attend the provision only for a couple of years. So you've got a constant cycle of parents, and getting people who, you know, will stay on once their children have moved on to their next setting can be quite difficult. So it's always a challenge in the early years to recruit really strong governors. So the head teacher reached out to a local specialist school to ask about, you know, how they might recruit a suitable SEND governor, and they managed to recruit an assistant head from the special school, who has since become the chair of trustees. So that was a fantastic piece of work of working together between mainstream and special, and actually getting, you know, the right skills on the governing body of the nursery school. And in terms of the positive outcomes, it's not just having that staff expertise or that governor expertise, but actually the nursery school are now providing early years inclusion places for the special school, which has significantly improved the provision from the special school. They also provide forest school experiences for primary age pupils from the special school. And the special school provides specialist teachers to support with SEND, and they also provide some leadership support as well. So a really positive outcome for everybody involved. The next case study that we're going to share is about school readiness. So again, thinking about the early years. This time it's a PVI nursery, so a private voluntary independent sector nursery, which had no relationship previously with any of the primary schools and wanted to look at transition for learners with SEND. So a big part of the new Ofsted framework, the EAF, is to secure better transitions for learners from the provision they're into the next provision. So it was a real priority for this particular setting. So the nursery manager approached a local primary school and worked with the early years teacher and the SENCO, but also the SEND governor. And this governor was particularly useful because she was the parent of a child with ASD. And between them, they devised a nursery to school transition programme to support their learners with SEND, which was really sort of innovative practice for a PVI nursery and really positively received both by the primary school and by the parents of children who were transitioning. So the sort of expertise and the sharing of skills was one of the positive outcomes there, but also some of the practical stuff. So the school actually provided class photo packs to introduce school staff. They sort of advised on transition activities that might be completed at home and supported parents in managing, good bedtime routines and getting sleep hygiene right. So a really, really effective piece of work there. Next case study that we're looking at is from a primary school, and this was about improving professional development opportunities. So the problem here was again about governor recruitment, I should say, and was a trust trying to get the right skills-based governors onto local governing bodies. So the trust CEO actually introduced governance experience roles in trust schools as part of trust-wide CPD for the leadership personnel. So it was sort of aimed particularly at assistant heads and deputies, as it was felt the head teachers had quite a lot to do in sort of, managing their own schools. And so in this particular instance, it was the head of primary and assistant head in a trust special school who was recruited to be SEND governor in one of the local primary schools. The positive outcomes were, again, about this sort of working closely, sharing staff and expertise, and it's led to a secondment from primary into special school for one teacher who was actually quite interested in crossing between sectors. So developing those strong relationships can often have further impact beyond, just dealing with that problem of being short of SEND governance. From the sort of the perspective of the specialist head of primary, she has actually reported that she really values the fact that she gets to spend time in mainstream schools, because if you're in special for a long time, you can forget what mainstream looks and feel like. So for her, she feels it's just keeping her in touch with what's happening in mainstream, and some of the developments that are happening are really exciting that she's been able to pick up on. And for the mainstream school staff, they feel that the CPD has been enriched and they now have access to a full range of postgraduate specialist teachers who are actually providing some of the BCPD programme for the school around SEND. So a really good opportunity to share skills and support each other. The next case study is another primary case study, and this was about the SEND information report. So there's a national duty, which we talked about and when we were talking about compliance and legislative duties in our first session, to provide a SEND information report and put it on your website. What most schools do is they sort of get the questions which they need to answer, which are in the Code of Practice in Chapter 6, and they create a document which has those questions in, and then they answer them in a Word format. Sometimes they'll put in photographs of children doing things or of provision, and that can sort of enliven the document a bit. But at other times, it can be a bit dry, if I'm absolutely honest, and it just becomes a list of things that answer those questions. And yes, it's compliant, and yes, it covers statutory duty, but it's not something that a parent or a child would automatically go to and look at. So what this school wanted to do was they actually wanted to make sure that their information report was actually informative and was a bit more exciting. So what they did was they worked with the pupils' parents, staff and governors to co-produce a video version of the information report. So they still had the written version as well, but actually all of the content of that written report was presented by children, by parents and by the governor within their little video sort of that you could click on the website, and certainly just a much more accessible way of sharing that information. The fact that the governor was able to co-produce the work, the governor reported they felt that they really understood how things worked in the school. They'd actually talked to the children as part of the making of the video, which was really positive for them. And it was that opportunity to celebrate some of the good practice rather than just sort of list it. And obviously statutory compliance, I should say, was achieved, which was really positive. And a special school case study next. This was about good practice in raising standards. So here the problem was a special academy within a trust, but a trust with no secondary provision, trust with special schools and primary schools. And they wanted to stretch the most able secondary pupils by being able to offer access to GCSEs, but didn't have capacity in the current staffing to actually deliver all of those GCSEs, you know, in a joined up way. So the solution was that the school leaders and governing bodies of both the special school and a local high school came together and discussed how an inclusion base could be set up on the site of the mainstream high school, from which young people could then access GCSEs in the high school but remain on the special school role. And with some funding from the special school local governing body, and I have to say, wasn't a huge amount of funding. I think it was about 20,000. They managed to refurbish a section of the high school to actually set up this inclusion base, which was then very effective. So the sort of positive outcomes of that are that the schools are again working really close together. I hope you're getting a bit of a theme here, that this idea that we work together, cross-sector, cross-phase. And the special school pupils are actually educated on the high school site now every morning in the inclusion base, with the possibility of going out and accessing the mainstream lessons, which was obviously difficult from their own school, which was a bus ride away. The Key Stage 4 pupils who attend the special schools now have access to the whole range of GCSEs, and they can select 1 or 2 GCSEs that they are interested in following, you know, if they are ready for that. The high school pupils, some of them actually join the inclusion group. So there are lessons that are running in the inclusion group that some of the high school pupils can come and access. And one of the things being particularly positive has been around personal, social, health, education and citizenship, where the level at which it was delivered in the high school was deemed to be quite difficult for some ASD learners, and they benefited from the specialist staff delivering that particular part of their curriculum content. The rest of the time they're fully included with their peers. So, you know, this opportunity to work together and co-produce solutions. Next case study then is another special school case study, and this one is about outreach. So we've got the fact that there's sort of outreach going on into mainstream, special schools going out and delivering that outreach around 2 particular areas. One was around learners with autistic spectrum disorder or condition, and learners who had behavioural needs. And what they were finding was that when they were working with children, they found that parents didn't have a lot of support around those particular needs. Often they were on quite long waiting lists for NHS provision. So what the school decided to do, working with their local governing body, was to set up some courses that were going to be delivered from the special school for parents of children who are in mainstream school. But also, you know, where possible, parents from the special school could also access the courses if they deemed them to be relevant. And the 2 courses that were delivered were Signet, which is Bernardo's programme, which is for parents of young people with autism, and Triple P Parenting, which is again an evidence-based course to support parents who are struggling with children who are presenting with some challenging behaviour. So the outcome of that was that waiting lists for diagnosis were significantly decreased. Indeed, what the school found was they were getting referrals from the NHS to the school provision, which was quite interesting, since it was something that the governing body had decided to do, you know, really to support mainstream schools. And the relationships between special and mainstream schools were again strengthened, but the key thing, and the thing that the school was most proud of, is that parental confidence in supporting their own children was really improved by access to these courses. So it was a great opportunity to use the expertise in special schools to support not only children in mainstream, but children and families, which I think is something that, you know, the school was really proud of. Moving into secondary, a couple of case studies here. The first one was about good practice in using SEND review to drive school improvement. So those people who were on the call last time, we went through how SEND review works. We talked about self-review, we talked about peer-to-peer review, and we talked about expert review. So this is on the back of an expert review. So we had a new SEND governor coming into the setting, trying to unpick what was happening with SEND and feeling a little bit overwhelmed, trying to understand things and you know, finding it very difficult. The solution there was to engage the expert SEND reviewer and to get some recommendations so that he could then work with the SENCO and senior staff to formulate the school action plan and decide what needed to be happening in the school to drive school improvement. The positive outcomes there were that the expert SEND review gave a really clear understanding of not only the areas for development that could go in the action plan, but also the real strengths that the school had and the things they were doing really well. The governors decided to actually put on some CPD for governors. And so what they did was they created little 30-minute clips of support. So these were very short CPD focus sessions that governors could attend. They were all videoed, so they could be sort of accessed either on the day when they were running, or governors could pick them up at a time that suited them. And they were just 30-minute drop-ins around different aspects of SEND. It doesn't need to be SEND. In our own trust, we do use this approach, and often, you know, we'll use it to look at finance, we'll use it to look at all sorts of aspects where we feel trustees or governors might benefit from a little bit more information. What was noticeable in the as a key outcome from this particular school was that in the sort of governor's minutes, it was very clear that the challenge around SEND provision that governors were able to make on the back of the SEND review was so much stronger, because there was a sense of they had the report and they could see exactly what it was that the school needed to be sort of doing next, and were able to ask some questions. And that meant that also the SEND information report was very much improved, because it was written from the point of view of a much deeper understanding of what provision looked like in the school. So I'm just going to pause a minute, because I'm very conscious of the fact that I've talked quite a bit there. So I'm just going to ask people that as I'm going through the next bit, if you've got some sort of excellent practice that you've got, little sort of mini case study, you can see the format's not great detail, but just something that you would like to share with other governors who are on the call this afternoon, then please just pop it in the chat. And when I do come to the end of this section, we'll just pick up if there's any sort of feedback anybody's got that you'd like to share. Okay. So looking at the secondary case study, the second one, this was about inclusive ethos and practice. So not so much a problem as just a new sort of venture. This sort of good practice here is about a free school in a multi-academy trust that wanted to realise a real vision for high aspiration and inclusive culture. And what they did was they actually sort of put their money where their mouth is and set up a school which is actually entirely built around a sense of inclusion for all, and a culture which values every child equally, and, you know, make sure that the support is available in class for learners to make sure that they can succeed in their classroom, and making sure they have the provision. One of the things that's really sort of key to this is the way in which staff are deployed. So this particular school does not use teaching assistants, not that there's anything wrong with teaching assistants, but the choice that the school made was to not use teaching assistants, but to actually enhance teaching staffing in classes where more support was required. And the positive outcomes have come from that are that all learners with SEND absolutely remain the responsibility of teachers, and that can be a challenge in schools where you've got great teaching assistants who are taking on some of that responsibility. So, you know, because the school didn't have those teaching assistants, definitely teachers were responsible for their children. High quality teaching was absolutely embedded as a consistent approach across the school. Staff coming to work in the school were trained in that as part of their induction, and that then became the norm for everybody. And this is easier to do, obviously, in brand new provision where you're setting it up in this way than it is to try and retrofit into an existing system, which is what most people are doing. But it's a lovely example of how things can work. The learning environment, the routines, everything was designed to include everyone, and outcomes for SEND learners in this school are above national. So a little bit of food for thought for you, and you know, something hopefully to stimulate something in the chat. Next two slides for education. So thinking about good practice in transition first. The problem here was a specialist sixth form college identifying that they had learners leave them at the end of their transition. So we're talking about learners leaving school at 19, at the end of their specialist college experience and transitioning into mainstream college. And what they were finding is that a number of learners, although they'd been very successful in the specialist provision, didn't transition well into the mainstream college and ended up not in education or employment or training, i.e. NEET, in the autumn term. So what they did was they worked with school leaders, the governing body and the college directors and principal to actually set up an inclusion base in the college, and having that little sort of space in the college, which was sort of attached to the specialist college, meant that young people had a base where they could go back to, and they were able to actually significantly reduce NEET within the first year of running. And in the 10 years that this provision is run, they have a very, very low number of pupils who end up NEET, because there is this sort of smooth transition from specialist college into mainstream college. The sort of knock-on impact of this is that the college staff, because they're working alongside specialist staff, all feel very upskilled, feel very confident in meeting need, and learners can transition when they're ready. So they don't have to wait till they're 19 to transition. They can transition anytime between year 12 and year 14 at a time that's ready for them. So making a huge difference to young people and preparing them for adulthood. And the second further education case study example I wanted to share with you is around good practice in securing employment. So the holy grail for young people with SEND is to actually get paid employment. And this was a mainstream FE college that identified that their destination data showed that over 3 years, none of their SEND learners had actually moved into employment, and they felt that that was not, you know, good enough for them or for their learners. So they formed a link with Project Search, which is a national enterprise, and the college directors absolutely supported them with this work, and the outcomes have been that Project Search now support college learners, well, college leavers, into SEND and into employment, with SEND, I should say, into employment. And the benefits mean that young people have actually sort of now moved into paid employment as a result of following the Project Search program. So it's typically a year long, and it's really impactful, and there are many examples of Project Search being used really effectively up and down the country. So I'd really sort of encourage you to look out for that in your own area. Okay, so I'm going to stop and be quiet for a moment and just see whether we have any good practice case studies in the chat or anything else in the chat that Helen or Nicole would like to share.
Claire, sorry to jump in. I've just seen that Claire Stiles has asked a really interesting question about whether you think you can still be considered inclusive if your pupils have dedicated one-to-one TAs. I think what is often missed when people are thinking about inclusion and making best provision for the learners we send is that inclusion is not a static set of provisions, but a journey. And it does say this in the Code of Practice. It says that inclusion is the progressive removal of barriers to education and participation. So the important thing is that you are providing the best that you can offer for those very vulnerable learners with what you've got right now. But it is equally important that you don't just stick with that same provision if it's not getting the outcomes that those children need. So it may be that at the moment that is exactly what they need and that's the best that you can offer. But thinking about preparation for adulthood and thinking about developing independence, that might not be the best thing for them forever. It might be something that is right for them right now. So instead of thinking about in terms of whether something is or isn't inclusive, it's most important that you're using the resources that you have in the best way that you can to meet those students' needs, and that is constantly under review.
Thank you, Nicole. I'd absolutely echo that, and I think, you know, that just because a school has one-to-one TAs doesn't mean automatically they're uninclusive, because it does depend on the nature of the pupil and their need. So in some schools, which you would argue are very inclusive, they might have a learner with very profound and multiple learning difficulties who needs a very high level of support because of the nature of their needs. So, you know, they may need to sort of have, you know, suctioning provided. They may need somebody actually on site to monitor health and to sort of make sure that they're actually sort of breathing appropriately or whatever. So, you know, there are levels of need that some children have, and they may well be educated in mainstream if that's been the parental preference and the school's able to manage that, who may need very high levels of need. The thing that is always worrying is where you've got teaching assistants who are absolutely Velcroed to children, because sometimes those children don't get the opportunity to be as independent as they might be if they had slightly less support. So, you know, there is no blanket answer to, you know, one-to-ones or not one-to-ones. It's about looking critically at your provision and saying, is it right? And as Nicole said, the key measure is, are our learners' outcomes the best they can be? And if they're not, then you might then start to look at your provision and say, what can we change here? But if your learners' outcomes are strong and you're preparing them well for the next stage of their education, then, you know, you don't need to make radical change. That's not what we're advocating. We're advocating a process of continual improvement, really, is what we're looking for across the piece. Helen, is there anything you've picked up that you want to come in on?
Hi, Angela. And Rebecca have shared kind of excellent ideas that they do kind of their trust. One in particular very interesting, talking about minds, kind of different ways to kind of, you know, just different thing to how they kind of respond kind of with the child with complex needs, kind of working through and using the pool, like really good kind of information in the chair for people to kind of pick up on, kind of just looking at their own kind of provisions.
Thank you for that, Helen. I don't know whether it's just me, but your sound was a little bit sort of wobbly there. Yes, there's some lovely stuff in the chat there. So please do sort of refer to that if you haven't already, because it is so important that, you know, we do feel we can share excellent practice, because what we're saying is you rarely go into one school and they've got absolutely everything right for SEND, but usually there's some lovely practice you can pick up on. And the more we celebrate and share that good practice, you know, the better we can feel about the fact that we are doing an amazing job. And, you know, as governors, we know that you are often sort of basically doing this in your own time, trying to fit in a huge role. I mean, I was just talking to Jill about the trustee role earlier and just saying it is an enormous expectation on people. So, you know, we do want you to feel that by and large schools are doing some great stuff, and we're not here at all to criticise what schools are doing. We're just trying to give you some prompts and some imaginative things that you might consider, but not everything works everywhere, and that's important. I noticed that in the question and answers we've had a question, so thank you very much, anonymous attendee, for popping a question in, because people rarely use the question and answer box, so we sometimes forget to look at it. But I've just seen that you've put something there which it says, would your organisation have any opinions regarding looking at national governance organisations to find qualified individuals for boards when there's not to match locally? And I mean, the quick answer is absolutely. There is really a need for skills-based people. The National Governance Association can sometimes help. Academy ambassadors, are another source of sort of really useful people who are keen to give up some time and support.
And sometimes it may be a good idea to get in touch with a local university. In my previous trust, we had quite a few interested people who were not connected up with Academy ambassadors or NGA, but they were university lecturers who were in the area of working in the area of SEND and just wanted to be able to offer more information to governing bodies, but also receive more information about what schools were doing. So we just put an advert up in the staff room in the university, and we got quite a lot of people interested. So that may be a way. And also large organisations, manufacturers, big stores, supermarkets, it's always worth trying, because you might find I'll say odd, I don't mean odd person, but you might find the odd person wanting to look at a role of responsibility in a school, but not quite knowing how to achieve it.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Nicole, in the chat that we need to pick up on?
Nothing that I'm particularly picking out, but lots and lots of good conversation like on the previous sessions, which is really great to see.
Excellent. You have to say you're our gold standard for chat on this particular series. We've never had as much enthusiasm and people putting things into the chat, so we really do appreciate your time thinking about that. So what we're going to do next is we're going to move on. And Jill Robinson OBE is going to present her take on the SEND link trustee role and how that works in her trust work.
Hi everybody, and thank you for inviting me tonight. And like Angela said, some very interesting questions which sometimes do get overlooked from governors during meetings. There's never time to ask questions, or never time to ask questions to the school staff. So what I hope to do tonight is just give you an example of the role of an SEND link trustee. You will probably know that the Code of Practice does specify that all schools should have a recognised SEN governor, but also that all academies do as well. And I think that is often missed. And that is sometimes missed when the school itself is an SEND academy, or they have several special schools within the trust in the academy. Most academies have a link on the governing body, which is great, but again, there is definitely a missed area in the case of the trusts, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So what we do is, in my trust, and I think it happens in lots of other trusts, is just look at the support that the link governor the link trustee can actually give to the standards committee or the outcomes committee, or whatever you want to call it, to make sure that there is close monitoring of the trust SEND arrangements. Now that can be quite difficult if the trust has several schools, several academies within. We have trusts that around the country that are 40, 50 schools, so you can imagine that that role is going to be quite significant. Second thing is to act as a board specialist on SEND. So to have some, I suppose, in-depth knowledge of what you expect to happen in all the schools within the trust, from schools that may be mainstream schools and schools that may be special schools. So to be able to ask the right questions, I suppose, is this happening? Is this not happening? And one of the things which, not in the trust I sit on now, but in a previous trust, was I asked a question around physical intervention, and it hadn't been picked up at all. Now, in some schools, that's quite an enormous responsibility on behalf of the school staff as well as the trust, but nobody had thought about looking into that particular area. So there will be aspects sometimes that the people sitting around the table are not aware of that is common practice in all special schools, but sometimes does go amiss in some mainstream schools. And to support the people on the Standards Committee or Outcomes Committee, and those committees are committees where we're looking at data, attendance, behaviour, all those nitty-gritty issues which enable you to measure the performance of the trust. So to give the people sitting around the table, I suppose, information about what they should be expecting so that they can hold the trust executive team to account. And the trustee should also understand the trust responsibility under the SEN Code of Practice. And to be honest, how many people have read it all through, who have been guided through it? It's a big document, and as a head teacher myself, I always thought that everybody knew about the Code of Practice, but some people knew bits of it, but having ownership of the whole of the Code of Practice is really important for the person supporting SEND across the trust. And to also be aware of the local and national context for SEND. And that's to make sure that the school is looking outside of the school walls. Networking is probably one of the most, I think, important aspects of all schools, that we don't miss what's going on in other parts of the country, and we're keeping in line with the national and local policy. The role, however, and this is where sometimes I get stuck, because having been a school leader and a head teacher for so many years, the role of the link trustee is a strategic one. It's not getting involved with the day-to-day practice in the school. And that's something that I've had to sit on my hands about, to be quite honest, because I want, as I suppose, on the trustee board, I want to know what's happening in the school. I want to know what's happening in the classrooms, but I can't be in there with my clipboard finding out. So we have to make sure that we can trust the people sitting around the table to make sure that that practice is going on. But it is not an operational role at all. The responsibilities really are liaising with the trust lead for SEND and any other member on the trust team who has a responsibility in this area. And that's really, I suppose, the first person you will be talking to is the SENCO. Now, as we know, in many schools, the SENCO is not part of the senior leadership team, so sometimes there can be an issue with that. But we need to make sure that we know what is happening within the schools in the trust. Being familiar with the school's SEND policy and contributing to its content if appropriate and practice across the trust, making sure that what is said in the policy is actually happening within the school. Ensuring that the trust policies are in line and up to date with guidance and statutory requirements, because things are always changing within the schools. And ensuring that arrangements are in place to enable children and young people with SEND to have access to the curriculum, and that the curriculum meets its needs. So making sure that the curriculum doesn't prize the children, prize itself into the children, that the children are the curriculum, and the curriculum is appropriate irrespective of their learning needs, so that there isn't just one curriculum across the school, that some children may have a slightly personalised curriculum for them to follow. So the area of which I do contribute quite a lot to is making sure that that curriculum is appropriate, so working directly with curriculum leads across the trust. Gaining an understanding of the strengths and areas of improvement with the SEND, and that these are reported to the Standards Committee. And I suppose that's really important, to make sure that what you find in the schools, or what you are liaising with the lead for the special schools and the mainstream schools in the trust, you then feed back to the people sitting around the table and the trust board. To ensure that each of the school's special educational needs coordinator, that's a SENCO, is receiving appropriate training, and more so that they are connected up with other schools, the SENCOs in other schools. To ensure that all staff are enabled to understand their role in supporting children and young people with SEND, so every class teacher realises that they are a teacher of SEND children, that it is their responsibility to provide an accurate curriculum and a meaningful curriculum, and that monitoring findings from the Academy's SEND reviews and ensuring the identified areas are followed up on. So making sure that reviews take place, but not only that they take place, that also there is a review of the outcomes. And I think that's something that Angela has talked about on a previous call. So the activities that I think the Trust Link Academy person should be for SEND is meeting with the Trust SEND lead at least once a month. And that's something which I do and I love to do, and I talk about the special schools within the Trust, and I talk about what's happening in the mainstream schools. To visit the other academies where necessary, so to make sure that they know who you are, that they can get in touch with you on a professional level if necessary, and meeting staff in the special school academies if the Trust does have special school academies within the Trust. And presenting a termly report to the Trust Standards Committee or the Outcomes Committee, so that they know that you're keeping an eye, not a critical eye, but making sure that all is safe within the work that children are following as far as SEND is concerned. So that's it in a nutshell. If anybody wants to ask any questions, then please do. But I think it's a very, very important role. And I think as far as some trusts are concerned, it's a role that's probably left out and not followed. It is within the local governing bodies, that all local governing bodies have a SEND governor, but sometimes in trusts it is overlooked, or it may be not as in depth as it should be. So that's it, Angela.
Thank you so much, Jill. And you know, I think sort of it's probably worth sort of saying, are you allowed to name the trust that you work for? Is it?
Well, it's the trust that was on one of the slides, so I think that's obvious. But having said that, I have been in contact with an awful lot of people who are in my similar role in trust and the activities that are being carried out. And they were put together by the trust, not me. It was their recommendation. Yeah. So I'm following their script really, which was fabulous, that they already knew what it was that they wanted. So I was given a job description and hopefully I meet the job description. But if anybody does need any direct support with that, please do get in touch with me and I can talk it through in a bit more detail. But it is a very valuable role, and it makes sure that all aspects of SEND are covered across the trust.
And how many schools are there in your trust?
I think there's over 25. I think it might be 27, 28.
And I think, you know, that's something that certainly in larger trusts, that role is even more critical, isn't it? Because you're not going to be able to sort of get the voice of each individual SEND governor without somebody like yourself who's coordinating that and capturing it really across the trust.
And it was in my trust, which was a smaller trust for only 3 special schools in the trust, that we still needed, and I still needed as the CEO, to be challenged about what was happening. So if any of you are in a special school, please make sure that you do still have an SEND governor sitting on your board, because it is essential. Don't assume that things are all going swimmingly ahead. There might be aspects that you want to ask those critical and nitty-gritty questions about.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to just open it up. So do we have any questions?
I'm gonna help out because Helen's having some problems with her sound.
Technical problems, yeah.
Got some questions in the Q&A though, so I'll read those out for you. How do you interact with SEND governors at the local level in a MAT as the SEND trustee?
That hasn't actually happened. I've only been a trustee since the summer holidays. I was on the outcomes committee or the standards committee prior to that as the SEND link, but it is something that is going to happen in the future. Whether or not I'll get round to all the schools, but one of my suggestions, which I'm going to share at the next trust board, is that we have an SEND governor event, which will actually make that possible, that it can be a very open event for people to meet me and to ask questions. So it could be just an hour or 2 hour extraordinary meeting where all the SEND governors can meet with me, and not necessarily moan and groan, but share practice really. So I know from them what the situation is within the school as far as SEND provision is concerned.
And I think with the advent of COVID, the only positive that we've got out of it is our remote learning and our remote contact. And I think now, particularly when you've got big trusts spread over a larger geographical area, a lot of trusts are maintaining a Zoom approach, and it is then easy to pull everyone together, isn't it? Because sometimes it's quite difficult if the schools are quite dispersed to pull everyone together for one meeting, although we still love face-to-face. But I think that Zoom option there, where you've got quite a big team and getting everybody together, is one to think about.
And I think it might be in those one-to-one chats for the person who's asked the question, that you may want to ask a question that you're not able to ask in a governing body meeting, and you want to pose that challenge, which sometimes can be very challenging for the person asking the challenging question. So I think it would give the opportunity, and then I can feed that back to the CEO of the trust. But obviously that hasn't happened within the trust I'm working for, but I do know other trusts that do have that forum for SEND governors.
Great. There's lots of questions, by the way. Next question. If I wanted to suggest an SEND expert review to my school, how would I go about setting this up? Can you signpost me to experts that would lead the review?
Yes, one here. There are a number of people who have been trained, and I'm sure if you got in touch with Angela or you got in touch with me, we could point you in the direction of somebody. They are mainstream and special school people, and there are sections in the review documents, particularly the whole school send and NASEN document. There are specific review formats for the different phases of school. So there is one for mainstream and there is one for special, and the review people are trained, and I hope they are all experts in carrying out the reviews. But that would be very, very easy to organise if you got in touch with either Seaview Trust or myself.
Okay, thank you. Do your trusts have a specific SEND committee? Is SEND the responsibility of another top level committee?
There is no special SEND committee. I suppose the committee is really me and the SEND lead across the trust, just the two of us. But when I have met that person, we have been able to talk very openly about various schools within the trust, and it could be something that in the future does happen, because I know this role, not necessarily in the trust that I'm working with at the moment. It is quite new, and it could be something that it could be something that's picked up by whole school send, to be quite honest, to put some kind of document together about the role, the links with the trust, because when the trust gets bigger and bigger and bigger, as some trusts have done, it gets more complicated, because SEND in one school will not be SEND in another school, and you may end up having 2 or 3 link SEND people. But it is a good point that there is a SEND committee, like a standards committee and a whatever committee, so it could be something that is looked at.
And I think it's a little bit like in the head teacher standards, there are domains of headship, And one of those domains is additional needs and SEND, but actually SEND is a lens through which you need to look through all aspects of the head teacher standards. And for me, it's the same in those meetings. So the fact that you were a SEND expert on the standards committee means that the standards committee will have been enriched looking at standards for SEND learners. So, you know, I think there are benefits of having a SEND committee, particularly as Jill was saying, in a large trust, to make sure there's some coherence and consistency, but also making sure that SEND isn't just siloed into a separate committee and runs through inclusively all of the work that the governing body are doing. So, you know, when we're talking about appraisal, when we're talking about other committees, thinking about, you know, and where does SEND sit within that? How are we making sure when we're developing our teachers, every teacher is delivering high quality teaching? Is that part of the appraisal sort of targets for teachers? So making sure that, as I say, not only is SEND seen as something that we need to focus on, but also something we need to use as a way of looking at everything we do.
Next question's a little bit different. Would your organisation have any opinions regarding looking at national governance organisations?
Oh, I think we answered that one, Nicole, before.
Did you already answer it? Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Next, this relates to what you were just saying actually. Is there a concern that SEND governance weakens in a large trust? Can it become too watered down and distant from the individual child?
I think that is something that has got to be raised, really, because it's very similar to the SEND children and the SENCO's responsibility, aren't they? So I think that's a mission statement really from the CEO to make sure that there is a thread across every single school within that trust that SEND has a high responsibility. In lots of trusts, the number of, particularly mainstream trusts, the number of SEND children is rising every year and becoming a significant part of the population. So it has to be high on the agenda. And I will be banging on the door of the CEO, to be quite honest, and making sure that this was, SEND did have a high priority. And like you were asking, it's not watered down because of the size of the trust, or it's forgotten in some cases. So yes, I do think that is an issue to bring up to the CEO and the chair of the trust.
And I think that the current Ofsted framework, the EAF that we're working on, has placed SEND very much front and centre. Yeah. And so any school that wants to present itself as good or outstanding has got to be focusing on what are they doing for SEND learners, how has the curriculum been adapted for SEND learners, how have policies like behaviour policies been adapted for SEND learners so that SEND exclusion is not higher than exclusion of other pupils who are in the school, that attendance for SEND learners is in line with the attendance of learners who are neurotypical and don't have SEND. So, you know, these are things that, you know, with my CEO hat on, I'm very focused on, and I know that Jill is as a governor as well. And that's one of the ways of sort of testing inclusivity, is actually asking those questions. So, you know, when you are sort of looking at data, you know, Jill and I used to sit on the Teaching School Council together, and we used to laugh that the only thing we ever used to say, and what about SEND? And what about SEND? Because there was a lot of mainstream focus, and SEND needed to be we needed to keep that constant reminder that SEND, you know, learners with SEND also needed to be thought about. So that's, if you are a SEND governor in your school or your trust, is, you know, that's a nice mantra to have in your pocket, isn't
it? In a trust, and notwithstanding necessary local adaptations, should the SEND policy be centrally led?
Personally, I think that the SEND policy should be a central policy, because you are one trust, you are one employer, you are responsible for all of your children, and therefore I believe that, you know, you should have one SEND policy which is applied. That doesn't mean that adaptations to individual schools' policies cannot happen for particular circumstances, particularly where you've got special schools and mainstream schools, and there may need to be certain differences. But the core policy, which is the trust policy and is the published policy for what we're doing about SEND, should be, you know, the trust's policy. Then the sort of schools individually should have links to that trust policy. One of the things that we've found in our trust is version control can become a bit of a nightmare. So what we do actually is we hyperlink back to the trust page. So each of our schools doesn't publish their SEND policy. We publish it on our trust page, and then they've got that hyperlink back.
Yes, I would totally agree with what Angela says there, because otherwise you could have random things put into your SEND policy, and if you were ever to get to tribunal level, that could open a can of worms, really, that in a trust each school had a different SEND policy, when actually all those children are very similar and their needs are similar. But like Angela was saying, adaptations may be added with specific reference to specific children. But I would really advocate a central policy. And usually trusts have a bank of central policies, which are then slightly changed depending on the needs and the situations of schools. So yes, I will be definitely saying that one policy.
And this is the last question in the Q&A at the minute. I'll have a look in the chat afterwards though. Is there a legal requirement to have a SEND trustee, or is it good practice?
Code of practice. The code of practice, paragraph 6.3, page 92. So yes, quote that, and it's obviously excellent practice. And I think if Mr. Ofsted was going to be looking at schools, that would be something that the SENCO would need to flag up, saying yes, we have an expert on the trust. Expert is a bit of a flamboyant word, but somebody who knows what should be happening within the schools, and making sure people are accountable based on what the code of practice said, because every child only gets one chance, and as a governor or a trustee, we need to make sure that happens for every child in the school and in the trust.
One of the things that I have noticed working with other trusts is that some trusts have moved away from having a SENCO for each school, and they've gone down the route of having one SENCO for the entire trust, and then maybe somebody at maybe higher level teaching assistant level in each school. And I worry about that, because it's such a big role, is the SENCO role, that for somebody sort of who has not got the sort of teaching qualification, which is a requirement for a SENCO to have a teaching qualification, to be responsible for a whole school, particularly if it's a large high school, it does concern me. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, because I think the SENCO qualification is quite strict, and it has to be worked on for quite a lengthy period of time, and it is something that we shouldn't just say one person can have and then we'll cascade it out into others, because there may be so many different interpretations of what should happen within the school. And if you think about the massiveness of that role, especially if things are not going right in lots of your schools, and how torn you're going to be, I wouldn't advocate that model whatsoever.
Any other questions, Nicole?
There's no other questions, but there's some really interesting comments in the chat, if you'd like me to share those.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So one that's caught my eye is Alison mentioning the overlap between safeguarding and SEND. This is obviously something that's particularly interesting to me as a SENCO DSL for a trust. And it's not a question as such, but I would kind of wonder how you would advise that you work alongside the trustee or the governors for safeguarding to make sure that that kind of complex overlap between two really significant vulnerabilities is managed.
In the trust that I'm a trustee, and the safeguarding link trustee sits on the outcomes committee as well. So I can see directly the presentations that are being made by the staff in the school with regarding safeguarding. I can view the outcomes, and any that are associated with SEND, then I've got the person on camera and hopefully face to face soon. But we also sit together, obviously, on the board. So we each of us knows what each of us is doing. So there's that automatic link between us. I don't think we could separate ourselves out, to be quite honest. I think that would be pointless. So yes, we do work closely together. Not closely together in that we're doing work together, but we have oversight of each other's work.
Some other comments and good practice being shared. Claire says that when they go in for monitoring, they look for evidence of variation in the pupils' work and then report that back. It contributes to a broader evidence base that the curriculum is accessible. Another person has shared about the importance of SEND trustees and governors asking challenging questions, and knowing what to ask, I suppose, is the challenge there.
Yes, and mine, Nicole, was around teen teaching, the physical interventions. And did the trustees know how many physical interventions were taking place in the schools, and was there justification if the numbers were high? And in some cases, you know, why was it that schools were not having to use the last resort of a physical intervention? You know, what was the difference? And that was quite an interesting conversation, which I don't think anybody had realised, but coming from a special school myself, that was obviously high on my agenda.
And I think that thing about, sort of, as I said before, when you're drilling into things like exclusion data, where there are high numbers of learners who have identified SEND who've been excluded, even if it's fixed term exclusion, actually sort of focusing in on that and checking that there's a process whereby the SENCO is involved. Because, you know, good practice would say that before a learner with SEND excluded, the SENCO should have an opinion on that, because that's the in-school expert, and they may actually, you know, sort of have some information that would be pertinent to that decision. And all too often in schools, that information doesn't happen till after the child's been excluded. So the process you go through, is it SEND friendly? And, you know, as I say, if you ask that about many of the policies that are in place, particularly thinking about, you know, children's lived experience, how, you know, included are learners with SEND in the broader sort of curriculum offer, the extracurricular offer, have they got access to all the same clubs and activities that everybody else has? What are the percentage of learners who have SEND in clubs and activities? You know, is that the same as children who haven't got any additional needs? And just looking at some of those things and asking whoever's putting the data for the school really to pull out SEND as a group, so that you can discharge your responsibilities by seeing how whatever it is that the school's doing works for learners with SEND and then other neurotypical pupils.
I think also whenever you're looking at data around SEND, exclusions, physical interventions, safeguarding, is having those conversations around it, because they're not necessarily targets. If there's a high number of a certain need type or a high number of physical interventions, it may be that was right for the situation, and it's not about increasing or reducing certain numbers, but about understanding why it's happening and then doing the wider conversations and the wider work around it. You've got a thank you for your answer about the policy. I think nice to be corroborated on something that is already fed back about. People sharing the same concerns about having the central SENCO and then HLTAs or assistant SENCOs in individual schools, about how SEN children need to be represented in positive data as well, particularly if they're represented on school council and in other school roles. For me, we also look at rewards data, make sure our SEN children are represented in rewards and trips and events and things like that as well. And also the links not only between SEN and safeguarding, but RSHE, PSHCE, online safety, and really, the list could go on, I'm sure.
And I think you know, in terms of sort of your point there about, you know, the send data, it's only a starting point. I mean, I think for me, all data is only ever a starting point. It gives you a line of inquiry and then you need to explore it. And just a good example that I've got very recently, doing a send review in a large high school where send learners did appear to be overrepresented in the exclusion data, but in a conversation with the head teacher, he very much defended that position and said it's because we actually apply our exclusion policy slightly differently for send learners, and where we perceive that their send condition means that they won't really understand a lengthy exclusion, then they will only be excluded for a very short period of time. And sometimes those exclusions are only for a couple of hours. It's just that child needs to actually have a break, go away and come back. And actually that would be really good practice. But of course, it then meant that the number of exclusions, if you looked at them as raw numbers, looked to be higher. But then when for some of the neurotypical learners, they were 3-day exclusions. So actually the amount of learning that children lost was no more. So, you know, it's those sorts of things where people are using nuances, sometimes the data doesn't tell the whole story. And it's that we would want governors and trustees to drill into and keep going and keep probing and asking those questions, because that's when we get to, you know, a real understanding. Because for me, this was a leader talking in a really inclusive way.
It's good to hear of a school recording those very short exclusions for SEN appropriately as well, because I think there's a lot of bad practice and also illegal practice around that, sending children home for a break, and that is technically an exclusion and it just not being recorded in the data. Lost information. We've got another question in the chat. What data should I be asking for as a new send governor at my school?
Oh, as much as possible, really, to find out all that you can about what the children's education is. So attendance, attendance is very important. If a child doesn't come to school, is there an immediate follow-up on that? Some schools have totally got rid of parents leaving messages on voice, on telephones, on the voicemail. And so finding out who is responsible for following up if children are not in school. Data, what kind of assessment is the school using? Hopefully it's not a commercial package that perhaps doesn't fit the needs of the school. Any more, Angela?
I think one of the things that I've picked up on recently is lots of schools have got, you know, some really sophisticated, and as you're saying, packages and software. And one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is pupil passports. And I've seen some excellent examples of pupil passports, but the question to ask is, are these pupil passports used by teachers in lesson to actually adapt the learning? Because however good the passport is, if it's on a sort of, you know, if it's held in a file system somewhere and it's not being retrieved and used by teachers to inform their teaching, it's not going to impact on the learner. So some of that information that, you know, what sort of learning walks take place in the school, what evidence is there that the structures and the policies that have been put in place, because most schools will present you a beautiful send policy, which is very compliant and says all these things happen, but does that really happen? And actually sort of testing out policy is really important.
Yeah, I think what Angela said about the passports, some schools are having a universal offer. So for each particular condition, there is a statement of what that condition is, and then how resources are adapted, meet the needs of the child in that lesson, and also to make sure that the pupil, if they are in a mainstream lesson, is just not receiving education from the teaching assistant, that the teacher does intervene at times with that pupil, so that you get some teacher contact. And I've been in schools where I'm not being disrespectful about teaching assistants at all, but there may be times during the lesson when the teacher needs to be finding out more about that child rather than rely totally on the teaching assistant's feedback, because often in a busy lesson there isn't time for that feedback. So how does the teacher then find out what the child has learned during the lesson? So to make sure that the offer in the classroom fits the needs of the child really is so important. And how does a teacher know about all the different conditions across the school, all the different adaptations, and not just to rely on the SENCO for that. Every teacher has that responsibility.
We've got a really interesting comment from Chip. Kind of relates to what you've just been saying, or at least it does to me. Regarding attendance in their school, they've shifted from expressing it as a child not attending or not coming in to use the language of the child not being brought, and that's really shifted the onus and the responsibility onto parents and carers. And I do, you know, little things like that can make a big difference, because it kind of sets out, it lays the table for what your intentions are and what your expectations are. I think language can make a really big difference. Just before I came on this call, I was just working on a resource for my own trust, looking at how you can review the golden thread from the EHCP and the professionals reports to ensuring that that is actually the reality in the classroom for the children, that those pen portraits are being used, that IEPs are being implemented, that strategies are the norm for those children. And I think actually evidencing it and articulating how that happens at ground level is the hardest thing for SENCOs quite often. But those are the challenging questions that need to be asked.
I think I've just made a recommendation for a trust where I was doing a review that they actually have SEND-focused learning walks where they pull pupil passports for learners in each of the groups they're going into, without, you know, saying which child they're going to pull the passport for, and then go in and then use it as a checklist. You know, if the child's supposed to have a sloping board, is it there? You know, if this child is meant to be sitting sort of nearer to the teacher, is that where they're actually sitting? Because, you know, the passports themselves are amazing, and they are, as you say, following that golden thread that they've come through the HCP, they've come through the annual review. You know, it's clear that this is a passport written for that individual child, but then if it's not happening in the classroom, it won't make a difference. So that's the key thing, is actually sort of having a system by which, you know, somebody on the leadership team is checking that these things are happening and the adaptations are being made, and you as a governor are able to see that, you know, the evidence that those observations are happening, and that there is confidence that the passports are being followed and the resources are available. So we're not saying that you as the governors would necessarily be going in and doing the learning walks. It's more a case that you need to check that there is a system by which the learning walks happen, and that the outcome of the learning walk is shared. So X% of classes, we saw that children had their resources with them, and they were actually following the passports, and what you'd be looking for would be a sort of improving sort of percentage of classes where that happened.
No more questions at present.
No more questions at present?
No, I've got my eye on it.
Thank you all so much for participating, for joining in, for asking your questions. You know, if you think of any more, then you know, please do pop them in the chat. We sort of the final thing that we wanted to sort of propose really is that we have just set up, indeed yesterday was our first dry run, we have just set up a SENCO network for Lancashire and West Yorkshire. So we are the team Lancashire and West Yorkshire, myself, Nicole and Helen, and we decided that a SENCO network would be something that would be useful for our SENCOs, for us to share practice. So what we would really like to offer is the potential of a network for governors and trustees across Lancashire and West Yorkshire where we could share information. So it's really over to you to ask whether, is that something you think would be useful? It could be potentially really short, just a half-hour session every half term, just to give you any new updates or share any great practice we've heard about. Or is that something that, you know, you would feel was too much of a demand on your time? So if anybody would like to provide feedback in the chat, or would just like to get in touch with us afterwards, I think our information is on the slides, our contact information. But just to understand, is there a need for a governors sort of group across Lancashire and West Yorkshire, and to be absolutely honest, it will be a Zoom meeting. Therefore, if you're not in Lancashire and West Yorkshire and you would like to join, we're happy for you to join, or your region may be offering a similar thing, you know, that you may be able to join in with. Okay, is there any response to that, Nicole? Because we're struggling to see the chat stuff.
what I'm doing, yes. Yes, the answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
So one person would like us to continue.
It's more than one person, but it seems redundant for me to read out all the individual.
Okay. Well, if that's something people would be interested in, obviously Nason Hall Schools then will have your email addresses. So as soon as we get our act together and get a date in the diary, we will share. Is this a good time for people to be joining us?
There is actually a question in the Q&A as well.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Want that now? Yeah. Is the model including training that you're adopting being replicated in other areas? And that's from Janet, who's a governor in a school on the Wirral.
So, sorry, just repeat that again for me, Nicole. Is the
model including training that you are adopting being replicated in other areas?
The model as in the review model, or what model, or this session, this format of 3 sessions?
It's a question from Janet Devine. I'm sure she can.
Would Janet like to come on, unmute yourself and ask us the question? Is Janet able to unmute herself?
She can't find herself. She has clarified that she came across this training almost by accident via colleagues on a Facebook page.
Ah, right. So
I've just unmuted myself. So thank you very much for that link. I came across it on a colleague who has a she's a national governance lead, and she posted the link to this course. It's been enormously helpful, and I've been trying to share it with my fellow Send Governor, but I didn't know there was anything regionally based at all. So I'm just curious as to what's happening in the area that covers Wirral and Merseyside, really, because clearly it seems a bit bonkers to direct our send towards the Lancashire West Yorkshire
well, just to reassure you, Janet, Merseyside, and I know it sounds ridiculous, but Merseyside and the Wirral are actually are part of Lancashire and West Yorkshire. It's a very strange place.
How did that happen? We're the insular peninsula over here, you know.
We go down to Liverpool for some interesting reason. So although it's called Lancashire and West Yorkshire, it does include Liverpool and the Wirral as well. So
right, well, we're the other side of the Mersey, so are we still included?
I think Sefton, and we really need Helen for this because she's based over there, so Helen will be much clearer on exactly which areas we cover, but certainly Sefton, I'm trying to think, St Helens is part of our patch. So I think, you know, which bit of Merseyside are you actually in? Which local authority?
Well, we're Wirral. We're a metropolitan borough of Wirral.
Yeah, Wirral is definitely in our patch. Yes.
Oh, okay, that's great. Thank you. So, yeah, that's very helpful.
Here we are. Helen's put the answer in: Sefton, Liverpool, Knowsley, Wirral. There you are. That is
marvellous. That's the Greater Merseyside city region. That's great. Thank you so much.
But to other people who may be on the call, including Sarah, who's in London, thank you very much for joining us. This was a series of webinars that we as Lancashire and West Yorkshire wanted to put on because we felt from our sort of research in the region, there was a need from people for some specific governance training. So each of the Nason Hall School Send regional teams has got 2 series of webinars. We're doing another series in the spring term, which will be on preparation for adulthood, and will be focused around the sort of universal, targeted and the specialist offer across all sectors again, because that's the work we would like to deliver next. But each of the regions have had their own little programme. So Jenny, how can people access the information about the other regions and the other programmes? What would you advise?
If you go on the SEN Gateway, you can see where all the events and everything are, and you can find your region and all the information on the gateway. I'll pop a link to it in the chat now.
Lovely. So Jenny's our support from Nason Whole School Centre. She's going to put the link in the chat so you can get on there and have a look at your own region. But I think we were the only region that delivered on governance this time. But if you are saying that, you know, it's a positive thing, then certainly, you know, we'd be more than happy to share the slides with other regions so that they can use them, because, you know, it's about making sure that people feel confident in their role, and that's all of our jobs, isn't it? So, yeah.
You have got another question. It's an outlier though. If we have time, I do have a random question. Oh, they've self-identified it as random. When should a child be placed on the SEND register?
When is a child placed on the SEND register? We had this debate with Senkos yesterday. Essentially, your universal offer is the offer you make for all learners in your school. Where a child needs something additional to or different from that universal offer, that is the point at which you may start to think they should be on the SEND register. But we get there by a process called the graduated response, which is assess, plan, do, review. So typically for a child, you might do 1 or 2 cycles of assess, plan, do, review before you make the decision to put them on the SEND register. And good practice would say the very first thing you would want to do before you're labelling the child as needing to be on the SEND register would be to go and get the Senko to have a look at that child in class and have an opinion about, is there anything that can be done to reduce barriers to learning and actually include that child without the need to put in something that is additional to and different from. And the reason I'm using additional to and different from is that is the language of the code of practice, and that is the thing that identifies SEND support. It is possibly the worst understood part of the code of practice. And unfortunately, and I apologise because I know there are amazing people working in local authorities, but local authorities haven't necessarily helped, because each local authority has produced its own guidance and shared it with their Senkos, and what it has ended up with is a huge muddle and people not knowing. And so we often in our work with Nason Whole School Send will go into schools and we'll meet some very confused Senkos. Worst case I had was a Senko with the smallest SEND register I'd ever seen in my life, and then a background list of all sorts of other children who should have been on the SEND register, but she was a bit worried about whether or not they should be on or not. So, you know, we're not actually trying to damage children by labelling them and putting on the SEND register. We're just making a note that these are the children who need something additional to, different from the offer for everybody else, and they're being placed on the SEND register basically to protect that additional to and different from. And if there is no additional to and different from, then they don't need to be on the SEND register. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, Alison's just chipped in, shouldn't over or under identify, but just robustly identify. I think for me, there's always, at some point you've got to make a decision. The Senko, part of being a Senko is you've got to make a decision, and that's why it's so important to work with your colleagues and not work in a silo where you're just doing that on your own, and have those conversations and gather your evidence, and then it's a lot clearer. Someone's just asked in the chat, should parents be informed if students are placed on the register? Yes, that's in the code of practice, that parents and carers should be involved at every stage and have lots of opportunities to discuss and talk. For me, the easy way of knowing if a child should be on the SEN register or not is, are you implementing something additional and different to everyone else, and are they subject to that assess, plan, do, review cycle, which can look different for different levels of need. So it's fine if that is part of a whole school system, as long as you can articulate that they are getting something additional and different, and that you monitor that and you review it and you decide whether it's served its purpose or not, and then what's going to happen next.
Absolutely, and I think what Nicole was alluding to there is, there's a debate about how to get children onto a SEND register, and then there's a debate about how you get them off again. Because some children need changes, because we're not static, and sometimes it's the circumstance around the child which is creating the need, and if the circumstance changes, then the child's needs change and we need to be responsive. So the SEND register is not a one-way ticket. You don't go onto a SEND register and then you're on it forever. You go onto a SEND register for the time you need to be on a SEND register. It may mean that as part of your need that it's unable to be met within SEND support, and you do need to move on to statutory assessment, but it is not automatic. Most people who will need some SEND support will not need statutory assessment, will not need an EHCP. So, you know, it's making sure that you as SEND governors feel confident about, you know, how that works. So we are going to, I think, finish now, because I'm thinking the time is up, but it's been absolutely amazing to sort of virtually meet you all. We've thoroughly enjoyed these 3 sessions and hope that that's been the same for you as well.